Welcome to my Hidden Truths channel. On July 27, 656, a young man's name was read aloud in an Amsterdam synagogue with a curse attached to it. The congregation had deployed the harshest ban in their community's history. He was 23 years old. He said nothing in response, asked for nothing back, and kept thinking. This video runs a little long. If you stay with me to the end, you might see what freedom actually is, and whether you have ever had it. Chapter 1. The Curse Read Aloud in Amsterdam. The synagogue on the Houtgracht was full that evening in late July. The Torah scrolls had been uncovered, and the shofar was blown. Not in celebration, but as a warning. The reader's voice then carried the words of the herem, the most severe formal ban the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community had ever issued. The name in the document was Baruch Spinoza. He was 23 years old, and no record survives of whether he was present to hear it. The herem still exists, and it is worth reading. It condemns its subject for abominable heresies and monstrous deeds, without specifying a single one. It instructs every member of the community not to speak with him, not to do business with him, not to read anything he had written, not to come within 4 cubits of his presence. 4 cubits. Less than 2 meters. An invisible perimeter was drawn around a young man, and everyone he had known was told to stay outside of it. What had he actually said to deserve this? The charges were never formally recorded, and historians have argued about the question for centuries. What we can reconstruct from the philosophy he spent the next 2 decades building suggests he had already begun questioning things no established community could afford to leave unquestioned. The divine authorship of Scripture, the immortality of the soul, the idea of God as a being separate from and above the world. These were not minor doubts. They cut at foundations. Consider what it actually means to hold an idea that your entire world declares contaminating, not merely wrong, contaminating, the way a disease spreads through proximity. The Amsterdam Jewish community had survived the Spanish Inquisition and fled Portugal carrying both their traditions and their grief. Internal unity was not a preference for them. It was survival. A man who pulled at the foundation of that unity was not merely a dissenter. He was a structural problem, and the herem was how the structure defended itself. Spinoza did not appeal. He did not soften his language, did not offer a partial retraction, did not perform the public contrition that might have opened the door again. There is no evidence he sought reconciliation, no surviving letter asking for reconsideration. What we find instead is silence, clean, deliberate, final. Before any of his philosophy, before any of his arguments about God or nature or freedom, this silence is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the man. He left Amsterdam and eventually settled in Rijnsburg, a small town near Leiden. He took up lens grinding, precise, physical work that paid just enough, and left the rest of his hours free. He lived with no institutional affiliation, no patron, no pulpit. A small circle of correspondents knew where to find him, and he answered their letters with care and without haste. In a practical sense, he was alone with the largest questions anyone had ever tried to think through systematically. There is a pattern here that runs through the entire shape of his life. Every institution that offered to contain him, community, university, patronage network, he found a way to step back from. Not from fear, not from aimlessness, but from a precise understanding that certain kinds of thinking cannot survive the pressure to remain acceptable. He had watched his own community wield acceptability as a weapon. He was not going to hand anyone else the same instrument. Most people who are cast out of the world they were born into spend years trying to get back in, or they build a smaller, safer version of the same world somewhere else. Different walls, same purpose. Spinoza did something rarer. He treated the excommunication as a clarification. The community had drawn a line to tell him who he was not. He stepped back from that line and spent the rest of his life finding out who he was. He died at 44, from a lung disease that had been quietly advancing for years. His friends, knowing both the importance and the danger of what he had left behind, arranged to publish his complete works almost immediately, carefully, without putting their own names on the project. The ideas they preserved went on to disturb 3 more centuries of settled thinking. What the curse in that Amsterdam synagogue had been trying to prevent, it had instead made inevitable. Chapter 2. The Man Who Refused the Crown. Somewhere in Rheinsberg, in a rented room above a surgeon's house, a man sat at a grinding wheel each morning and worked glass into precise curves. The work was quiet and exacting. It required holding one thing steady while applying controlled pressure, a discipline that suited him. The lenses he produced helped astronomers see further into the sky and physicians further into the body. He made them for a living and told very few people what else he did with his hours. There is something worth noticing about lens grinding as a profession for this particular man. A lens does not draw attention to itself. It is transparent by design, a means of making something else more clearly visible. Spinoza spent his working hours crafting instruments of invisible service, objects whose entire purpose was to disappear into what they revealed. It is difficult to believe he did not notice the parallel to what he was attempting with philosophy, a thinking that pointed away from itself towards something larger. In 1673, a letter arrived that would have changed the life of almost anyone else. It came from Karl Ludwig, Elector Palatine of the Rhine, carried by a professor named Fabricius. The offer was genuine and generous, a chair in philosophy at the University of Heidelberg, with a promised salary and formal assurances of intellectual freedom. For a man living on the income from lens grinding, corresponding with admirers who barely knew where he slept, this was not a small thing to be offered. Spinoza declined. His letter of refusal repays careful reading. He told Fabricius he could not be certain the promised freedom would extend far enough, that the phrase "within the limits of the established religion" buried inside the offer was, as he wrote, too narrow a constraint. He did not want a position that required him to be careful about what he said. He had spent 17 years learning what careful cost, and he had no interest in paying it again from a more comfortable address. This was not an isolated moment. Wealthy admirers offered ongoing financial support that would have freed him entirely from manual work. He accepted only the smallest amounts, insisting on preserving the distance that real independence required. When his major work on religion and politics appeared in 1670, it was published anonymously, with a false city of publication printed on the cover. He made himself, as a locatable, identifiable person, as difficult to find as possible, even as his arguments spread everywhere. We live now in a world that has made the opposite calculation. Visibility is the currency of intellectual life, followers, reach, impressions, the carefully managed public persona. The thinker, the artist, the scientist is encouraged to build a platform, to remain legible to the largest possible audience, to stay present and findable. There is almost no space left in the serious world for the kind of thinking that requires genuine privacy to form itself. Spinoza would have recognized this pressure immediately. He would also have recognized, with quiet precision, what it does to the thinking. When you know you are being watched, something shifts. The thought that forms in private, unfinished, risky, genuinely exploratory, is not the same thought that forms under observation. The audience does not need to say anything. Their presence alone is enough to pull the mind toward the acceptable, the defensible, the presentable. Spinoza built his entire intellectual life on the premise that this gravitational pull was not a minor inconvenience. It was lethal to the kind of philosophy he wanted to practice. The people who visited him describe a man of unusual calm and regular habit. Leibniz came in person in 1676, though he would later minimize the encounter when Spinoza's name became too dangerous to be seen near. Henry Oldenburg, secretary of the Royal Society in London, corresponded with him for years. Spinoza answered everyone thoughtfully, on his own schedule, from his own address, without adjusting his thinking to make it easier to receive. He engaged the world without letting the world set the terms of the engagement. The glass dust was real, of course. It settled in the lungs over years of daily work. Whether it shortened his life or simply accompanied a body already weakened by hereditary illness, no one has ever been certain. What is clear is that he understood the physical cost of the work and kept doing it anyway, because the alternative, accepting a salary and a title and a set of quietly implied obligations, would have exacted a different kind of cost entirely, one he had already calculated and refused. He had curated a life narrow enough to protect the work and wide enough to stay human. Chapter 3. God, or nature, or whatever you want to call it. Picture the structure of a prayer. There is someone here, reaching towards someone out there, across a gap, across a difference in kind. The being addressed is elsewhere, above the world, before the world, authoring the world from a position outside it. This gap is not incidental to traditional religious experience. It is the architecture on which everything else depends. The creator and the creation must remain distinct, or the entire relationship loses its meaning. Spinoza looked at this structure and said, as quietly as a man can say something explosive, there is no gap. Not because God does not exist, but because God is precisely what exists. All of it, the complete, self-sufficient totality of everything that is. He did not remove God from the picture. He expanded God until there was no outside left, until God and the world referred to the same thing, seen from different angles. He captured this in two Latin words joined by a conjunction, Deus sive natura, God or nature. The or here is not a choice between two options, it is an equation. He was saying these words name the same thing, that theology and physics are different languages, describing a single reality. 350 years later, that proposition still produces a particular kind of vertigo, because it does not leave you anywhere comfortable to stand. The accusation leveled at him, then and for centuries afterward, was atheism. He found this almost beside the point. An atheist simply removes God from the picture. The argument with an atheist is familiar. You dispute the evidence, debate the first cause, trace the logical thread back until it breaks. But Spinoza does not remove God. He relocates God into everything, into the stone, the storm, the thought you are having right now. That is considerably harder to dismiss. The consequences spread immediately into everything religious tradition had organized itself around. Divine providence, the idea that God arranges events to serve purposes, that history bends toward meaning, that prayers change what actually happens, becomes, under this framework, incoherent. There is no being standing outside events and redirecting them. What we experience as providence is the natural unfolding of causes we do not fully understand interpreted through a human need for the world to be listening. Miracles presented the same problem, and Spinoza was precise about it. A miracle, in the traditional sense, is an event that violates natural law, a suspension of the rules by the rulemaker. But if God is identical with nature, then God's nature is expressed through natural law, not interrupted by it. A God who performed miracles would be a God contradicting himself. The inability to perform miracles is not a limitation on God's power. It is what God's power actually means. What Spinoza offers instead is a different, and in some ways stranger picture. The universe does not follow its laws because God decided on them, the way a legislator decides on statutes. The universe expresses its laws the way a triangle expresses its angles, necessarily, completely, without alternative. The mathematical properties of a triangle are not imposed on it from outside. They follow from what a triangle is. Everything that exists follows, in the same way, from what existence is. Human beings, inside this framework, are not creatures fashioned by a craftsman who had a design in mind. We are expressions. Modes, Spinoza called them, of the single infinite substance. The way a wave is an expression of the ocean. We do not stand apart from nature, looking in at it from some separate vantage point. We are nature looking at itself through a particular, temporary configuration of flesh and thought. The distance we feel from the world is itself part of the world. Albert Einstein, asked centuries later whether he believed in God, replied that he believed in Spinoza's God, a God revealed in the lawful harmony of all that exists, not one who concerns himself with the fates and actions of individual human beings. Einstein was not being evasive or reaching for poetry. He was using the most precise language he had, and he was not the last scientist to find that precision there. To take Spinoza seriously on this point is not to lose God. It is to stop being able to find the edge of him. Chapter 4. The body is the mind spelled differently. René Descartes, in the winter of 1619, shut himself inside a room heated by a stove somewhere in southern Germany and had a series of dreams he believed were sent by God. From those dreams, and the hours of solitary thinking that followed, he arrived at the proposition that would define the next 3 centuries of Western philosophy. He could doubt everything except the fact that he was doubting. The doubting thing, the mind, was to him the one certain foundational reality. The body was another matter entirely. It was made of matter, extended, mechanical, divisible into parts. The mind was none of those things. It was unextended, immaterial, a thinking substance with no physical dimensions whatsoever. 2 things, then, one mental, one physical, fundamentally different in their essential nature, and yet, somehow, undeniably, interacting constantly. Every time you feel hunger, a physical state is producing a mental one. Every time you reach for something, a mental state is producing a physical one. Descartes knew this was a problem. His proposed solution, that mind and body communicated through the pineal gland, a small structure at the center of the brain, was unconvincing even to his contemporaries. And he seems to have sensed it. He had created a gap between mental and physical that no physical mechanism could bridge, because physical mechanisms were precisely what the mental was supposed to transcend. The problem had been constructed with such precision that it was insoluble, which is what happens when the premise is wrong. Spinoza's solution was not to build a better bridge. It was to notice that there was never a river. Mind and body are not 2 different substances that somehow meet and influence each other. They are 2 different attributes of the same substance. 2 languages, equally complete, that describe the same event from different angles. When your body undergoes a change, your mind undergoes a corresponding change, not because one caused the other, but because they are the same change expressed in two different vocabularies. He called the relationship parallelism, though the word understates what he meant. The order and connection of ideas, he wrote, is the same as the order and connection of things. Every physical event has a mental correlate. Every mental event has a physical correlate. Not because one produces the other, but because they are the same event perceived from two directions. The mysterious interaction between mind and body dissolves the moment you recognize that there was never an interaction. Only one process, moving through reality in two registers simultaneously. This is not a historical curiosity. In the past 3 decades, neuroscience has arrived at something that rhymes deeply with Spinoza's framework. Antonio Damasio, one of the most cited neuroscientists of his generation, wrote an entire book titled, With Deliberate Provocation, looking for Spinoza, arguing that modern brain science keeps rediscovering what the Amsterdam lens grinder had already put on paper. Emotion is not something that interrupts cognition from the outside. It is cognition. The feeling body and the thinking mind are one process, examining itself. The practical implications are significant and strange. If mind and body are the same event described differently, then there is no purely mental illness and no purely physical one. Depression that presents as a disorder of thought is always also a disorder of the body. Chronic pain that registers in tissue is always also registering in the structure of consciousness itself. The therapist who ignores the body and the physician who ignores the mind are both working with half a picture, and half a picture of a human being is not a diagnosis. You may have felt this without having language for it. The way grief lives in the chest and the throat, not just in thought. The way sustained fear changes how food tastes, how light falls on familiar rooms, how the future appears. The way a genuinely new idea clicking into place feels physically distinct from the ordinary movement of thinking. These are not metaphors. The body and the mind are not trading signals across a gap. They are one thing, registering its own states in two simultaneous languages. Descartes' error was not stupidity. It was a premise that felt self-evident and arrived too early to be tested. That the thinking thing and the extended thing are obviously, irreducibly different. Spinoza looked at that obviousness and asked what it would mean if it were wrong. The answer he found was not a compromise. It was something cleaner and more unsettling, that the question of how mind and body relate was always asking in the wrong direction. There is no relation. There is only one thing, and we have been arguing about its translation. Chapter 5. The quiet engine called conatus. Watch a plant growing toward a window. There is no deliberation involved, no moment of decision, no weighing of options. The stem simply bends, slowly and without announcement, toward the light. If you move the plant to a different corner of the room, the bending begins again, in the new direction, toward the new source. The plant has no goals in any sense we would recognize, and yet something in it insists on continuing, on turning toward what sustains it, on persisting. Spinoza called this conatus. He meant something precise by the word, not a metaphor, not a poetic observation about plants and their windows. He meant a universal metaphysical principle. Everything that exists, insofar as it exists, strives to persist in its own being. The stone resists forces that would break it. The immune system repels what threatens the organism. The mind works, even in sleep, to maintain the coherence of the self that thinks it. This striving is not something beings possess in addition to their nature. It is what their nature consists of. The principle operates across the full range of existence without exception. A rock's conatus is simple, the structural integrity of its molecular bonds holding against pressure and erosion. A tree's is more complex: growth, repair, reproduction, the routing of water and nutrients through systems of extraordinary delicacy. A human being's is more complex still, because the thing doing the persisting is itself a moving target. We are not simply maintaining a body, but maintaining a particular way of thinking, feeling, relating, understanding a form of life that is always in the process of either developing or contracting. This is where the principle becomes uncomfortable. Spinoza is not saying that human beings have drives and urges that we sometimes notice and sometimes manage. He is saying that every single thing you do, every choice, every preference, every belief you hold and feeling you pursue is an expression of this one fundamental striving. You are, at the deepest level of what you are, an entity that is trying to continue. Everything else is a form of that. Take a moment to sit with this. The relationship you are protecting, the career you are building, the ideology you defend with, what feels like genuine conviction, all of it, examined from Spinoza's angle, is conatus finding its way through the particular circumstances of your particular life. This does not make these things false or unimportant. It situates them inside a larger and more honest account of why human beings do what they do. We tell ourselves stories about our motivations that are usually only partially true. Conatus is the part the story tends to leave out. The distinction Spinoza cares about most is between conatus that operates through adequate understanding and conatus that operates through confusion. In the first case, the striving expresses what you genuinely are, your actual capacities, your real interests, the development of your essential nature as a thinking and feeling and relating being. In the second case, the striving has been captured by things that feel like your interests but are not, the status that substitutes for self-respect, the dependency that substitutes for love, the busyness that substitutes for meaning. The engine is the same, the fuel is different. Contemporary psychology arrived at adjacent territory through a different route. Research on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation consistently shows that human beings function best, sustain effort longest, produce most genuinely, report the most durable satisfaction when their activity flows from internal engagement rather than external reward or the fear of external punishment. This is conatus in the language of experimental science. The striving that expresses your nature produces a different quality of life than the striving that merely responds to pressure. Spinoza had the structure correct 300 years before anyone ran the studies. What he adds, that the studies tend not to, is the political and social dimension. Conatus does not operate in a vacuum. The conditions under which people live determine which forms of striving become available to them and which get foreclosed before they can take shape. A society organized around scarcity, competition, and the chronic threat of exclusion will produce human beings whose conatus has been narrowed into forms of defensive persistence. They are still striving, but towards smaller and smaller versions of what they might have been. The engine runs in everyone. The question is what it has been given to run on. Chapter 6. The slavery you don't know you're in. Think of the particular quality of waiting for a message that does not arrive. The phone is there. You have checked it. It has not changed. You check again, not because you expect it to have changed in the last 30 seconds, but because the waiting has become intolerable, and checking is the only action available. This is hope and fear occurring simultaneously. the mind suspended between two futures it cannot control, spending itself on a situation it cannot alter. Spinoza had a name for what is happening in that moment. He called it a passive affect, an emotion that arises not from your own essential nature and activity, but from external circumstances you do not adequately understand or control. The key word is passive. You are not generating the emotion. You are receiving it, the way a surface receives weather. The emotion is happening to you, and the fact that it feels deeply personal does not change the direction of the causation. Hope and fear, he argued, are not opposites. They are the same mental state seen from different angles. Both arise when you care about an outcome you cannot determine. Hope is the pleasant version, the imagination of a good future held against the possibility it might not arrive. Fear is the same imagination, with the emphasis reversed. He considered both signs of inadequate knowledge, because a mind that understood its situation clearly would not remain suspended between them. This was not a call for emotional numbness or deliberate detachment. He was not recommending that we stop caring about outcomes. What he was describing, with the precision of someone who had examined his own inner life very carefully, was a particular structure of suffering. The suffering that comes not from what is actually happening, but from not knowing what is happening, and from having staked your sense of well-being on circumstances that have not yet declared themselves. The passive effects form a recognizable family. Envy arises when another person's good fortune reads, in your confused accounting, as a diminishment of your own. Anger arises when events fail to meet expectations you had no real basis for holding. Shame arises when you measure yourself against standards absorbed from people who may never have had your interests in mind. None of these are character flaws. They are each a specific form of not seeing clearly enough, a symptom, not a sentence. The problem is that most people experience passive emotions not as symptoms of confusion, but as evidence of reality. The anger feels like an accurate reading of the situation. The envy feels like a reasonable response to an unfair world. The shame feels like honest self-knowledge. We do not experience our passive effects as distortions. We experience them as truth. This is what makes them so effective as a form of captivity. The cell is built from materials that feel like clarity. Consider how this maps onto the architecture of contemporary life. The attention economy has been engineered with precision around exactly these vulnerabilities. Platforms optimize for emotional responses that keep users engaged, and the emotions that do this most reliably are the passive ones: outrage, anxiety, envy. The restless comparison of your own life against curated presentations of others. This is not a coincidence. It is a business model built on passive effects, operated by people who may never have read Spinoza. Active effects are different in a way that is difficult to describe without sounding like a self-help manual, which Spinoza was not. An active affect arises when the change in your power of acting comes from inside, from understanding, from genuine creative engagement, from love that enhances rather than binds. Joy in this mode is not pleasure received from outside. It is the sensation of your own capacity expanding. It does not require anything to be happening. It requires you to be genuinely present in your own activity. The transformation from passive to active is not a decision. You cannot simply choose on a Tuesday morning to stop being governed by hope and fear and envy. What Spinoza is describing is something slower and more structural. The gradual process of developing more adequate understanding of yourself and your actual circumstances, until the passive effects lose their grip, not because you suppress them, but because the confusion that generated them has been replaced by something more accurate. Most of what we call our emotional life is, in this reading, not life at all. It is whether we have mistaken for character, and captivity we have mistaken for self. Chapter 7. A freedom that does not need choice. A pianist who has spent 10,000 hours with a piece does not, in performance, consciously choose each movement of her hands. The fingers find the notes before the decision to play them has fully formed in thought. The music arrives through her, from some place below deliberation, without requiring consultation. And yet no one watching would describe what she is doing as unfree. Something in the quality of it, the way the playing is unmistakably, completely hers, could not be called anything else. The philosophical intuition underlying most of our moral thinking is that freedom requires alternatives, that for an action to be genuinely yours, you must have been able to do otherwise. The judge sentencing someone assumes they could have chosen differently. The framework that assigns praise and blame depends on this assumption entirely. If you could not have done otherwise, the entire structure of accountability loses its foundation. This is the picture Spinoza set out to dismantle, carefully and without apology. He was a committed determinist. Everything that happens, every thought, every choice, every turn taken or not taken, follows necessarily from prior causes, which follow necessarily from prior causes before them, all the way back to the nature of the single substance that constitutes reality. The feeling of genuine deliberation, of standing at a fork with the path genuinely open in both directions, is real as an experience. It is not accurate as a description of what is actually occurring. This sounds like the end of ethics. If nothing could have been otherwise, what are we doing when we praise courage or condemn cruelty? Spinoza's answer is to change the question. He does not ask whether you could have done differently. He asks what you were determined by. Not all causes are the same kind of causes, and the difference between being determined by your own nature and being determined by something external to it is the entire space in which freedom actually lives. When a stone falls, it falls because gravity acts upon it from outside. When a frightened person lashes out, they act because fear, generated by inadequate understanding of their situation, presses on them from a position they cannot fully examine. In both cases, something external is doing the driving. Spinoza called this kind of determination bondage, not chains on the wrists, but something operating at a deeper level, shaping behavior through forces the person has not chosen and cannot clearly see. Freedom, by contrast, is when the cause of your action is internal, when what you do flows from your own essential nature, understood clearly, rather than from external pressures inadequately understood. The person who argues from genuine conviction, rather than the need for approval. The person who forgives not from social pressure, but from actually understanding how human beings come to be what they are. These people are still caused. Everything is caused. But the cause, in their case, is themselves. The implications for moral responsibility are significant. Spinoza does not conclude that, because everything is determined, no one is accountable for anything. He concludes that retribution, punishment aimed at making someone suffer for what they could not have done otherwise, is philosophically incoherent and practically useless. What replaces it is more honest. The question of what conditions, what understanding, what experience would develop in a person the capacity to act from their genuine nature rather than from confusion and fear. Most of us have inherited a conception of freedom that looks like a menu. To be free is to have options, and the more options the better. This is why freedom and consumer choice have become so thoroughly intertwined in contemporary life. The market presents itself as the delivery mechanism for maximum possibility. Spinoza would not have called this freedom. He would have recognized it as captivity made comfortable enough that it rarely occurs to anyone to ask who designed the menu, or why certain options are never listed on it. The path toward genuine freedom, in his account, is not the accumulation of alternatives. It is the gradual process of coming to know your own nature clearly enough that your actions begin to flow from it, rather than from the pressures and confusions that have been mistaken for it. This is slow work. It cannot be rushed or optimized or acquired through any mechanism of consumption. It requires the willingness to examine, with honesty and patience, what is actually driving you, and to remain with what you find. The terrifying possibilities Spinoza raises is not that we are unfree. It is that most of us have not yet begun to be free in the way he means, and have not noticed the difference. Chapter 8. The Three Ladders of Knowing. A man grows up in a town where everyone believes the river floods in August because the spirit of the valley is angry. He has seen it flood in August. His grandfather saw it flood in August. The elders say the same words their elders said, and the words have never been contradicted by experience. Because no one in the town has ever measured the snowmelt upstream, or mapped the catchment basin, or asked a different kind of question. He is not stupid. He is operating at what Spinoza called the first kind of knowledge, imagination, in the philosophical sense of the word. It has nothing to do with creativity or fantasy. It is the mode in which most human cognition actually runs. Belief formed through sensory impression, received testimony, repeated association, and the accumulated weight of what everyone around you already assumes to be true. It is knowledge of a kind, functional enough for navigation, insufficient for understanding. Most of what passes for public debate occurs entirely within this register. Opinions formed through exposure rather than investigation. Moral positions adopted through cultural proximity rather than examined reasoning. Political convictions held with fierce certainty whose actual foundations, if traced backward, dissolve into the particular accidents of biography. Which country, which family, which social media algorithm first made a certain picture of the world feel like common sense? Spinoza does not call this stupidity. He calls it the normal condition of human minds that have not been disturbed into looking further. The second kind of knowledge is reason, systematic, disciplined, capable of grasping universal principles that hold independently of any particular experience. When you understand why the river floods rather than simply knowing that it does, when you can trace the mechanism from mountain snowpack through drainage patterns to seasonal overflow, something changes in the quality of your knowing. The particular event becomes legible as an instance of a general principle. You can predict, explain, and eventually intervene, none of which the first kind of knowledge permits. Reason is what the sciences practice at their best, what rigorous philosophy attempts, what a genuine education is supposed to cultivate. It replaces the accidental associations of imagination with necessary connections. Relationships that hold not because we observed them together once, but because we understand why they belong together. This is more reliable, more transferable, more useful for building shared understanding across different people with different experiences. It is also, for most of its practitioners, where the ladder ends. Spinoza thought it was not the top. Above reason, he placed what he called intuitive knowledge, a mode of understanding so different from the other two that it is almost impossible to describe without making it sound mystical, which it is not. Intuition, in his sense, is the capacity to grasp particular things in their concrete singularity, not as instances of abstract categories, but as specific, necessary expressions of the whole. To see not just that love follows certain patterns, but how this love in this person is the precise and inevitable shape that this particular life's striving has taken. The distinction matters because reason, for all its power, deals in universals. It can tell you that grief follows loss, that fear responds to threat, that human beings under certain conditions reliably behave in certain ways. What it cannot do is show you this grief, in its specific texture and weight, as the necessary expression of this particular person's capacity to love. That requires something closer to what artists do when they are working at their best. A seeing that is both precise and total, that grasps the universal through the particular rather than in spite of it. Most people, Spinoza suggests, never arrive here, not because they lack the intelligence, but because the movement from the first kind of knowledge to the second already requires a willingness to have your existing certainties disturbed, and that willingness is not common and is not rewarded by most of the institutions that shape how people think. The movement from the second to the third requires something further, a dissolution of the distance between the knower and the known that feels, from the inside, less like acquiring information than like becoming a different kind of person. This is the peculiar poverty Spinoza is pointing at. Not the poverty of having too little, but of living inside a form of understanding that does not know what it is missing. The man by the river is not suffering from his explanation of the flood. He is suffering from never having stood at the top of the watershed and seen where the water actually comes from. The ladder is there. Most people take it for a wall. Chapter 9. The love that has no object and no end. There is a particular quality to the moment when a mathematical proof clicks into place. Not just that you follow the steps, but that you see, suddenly and completely, why it must be true. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion feels necessary in a way that ordinary facts do not. You could not have understood it differently. The truth was always there. Your mind has simply arrived at the position from which it becomes visible. Spinoza believed this experience was not merely intellectual satisfaction. He thought it was a glimpse, limited, brief, but real, of his third kind of knowledge in practice. From it, he developed one of the most unusual ideas in the history of philosophy, that the human mind, through the cultivation of adequate understanding, participates in something eternal, not after death, but now in the act of understanding itself. He called the culmination of this process amor intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God. The phrase sounds religious, and Spinoza was not unaware of the echo, but what he meant by it was precise and carried no supernatural content. When the mind grasps something truly, sees a particular thing sub specie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, as a necessary expression of the whole rather than a contingent accident of circumstance, the joy that arises is not pleasure received from outside. It is the mind's recognition of its own deepest nature. This love is intellectual because it arises from understanding, not from attachment to any particular finite thing. It is directed toward God or nature because its object is not any individual thing, but the infinite totality expressing itself through all individual things, including the person doing the understanding. And it constitutes love in the fullest sense because it is joyful, because it sees what it sees clearly, and because it asks for nothing in return. There is no transaction, There is no object that could be taken away. Most love in ordinary life is passive in Spinoza's sense, shaped by need, by the history of specific attachments, by the hope that the loved person or thing will remain and continue to provide what they have provided. This love is real and human, and he does not dismiss it. But it carries inside it a permanent anxiety. The thing loved can be lost. The person can leave. The body ages. Every love of a finite thing contains, somewhere in its structure, the knowledge that it will not last. The intellectual love of God does not work this way because its object is not finite. What the mind touches when it understands something truly is not a particular arrangement of matter that will eventually dissolve. It is the necessary structure of reality itself. The relationships that hold without exception, that could not be otherwise, that would remain true in any possible configuration of the universe. When you understand a genuine truth, you are not creating it. You are joining it. And what you join is not going anywhere. The part of the mind that participates in this is what Spinoza calls eternal, not in the sense of continuing through time forever, but in the sense of existing outside the sequence of time altogether. Duration is the experience of finite things moving through change. Eternity is the dimension of truths that do not move through anything. A geometric relationship does not become more or less true as centuries pass. Neither does the love that arises from understanding it genuinely. Here is where Spinoza makes the claim that is easiest to dismiss and hardest to forget. The cultivation of this understanding is not a preparation for a better life elsewhere. It is the best possible life here, the one form of human activity that delivers what every other form promises and cannot ultimately provide: permanent satisfaction. A joy that does not depend on outcomes. A relationship with reality that nothing external can interrupt, because nothing external provided it in the first place. You may have touched the edge of this without naming it. A moment of genuine understanding of a person, a problem, a piece of music that suddenly made complete sense. When the ordinary background anxiety of being alive briefly lifted, and something quieter and more stable took its place. Spinoza's claim is not that this was a pleasant accident. It was the mind arriving briefly at what it was built for. Most people live at the surface of their own capacity to understand, and assume the depth is not there because they have not looked. Chapter 10. The heretic who outlived his century. The friends who gathered Spinoza's manuscripts in the weeks after his death in 1677 understood the situation precisely. They worked without signing their names to anything. Arranged publication through channels that provided some insulation from the accusations they knew were coming, and released the complete works into a Europe that was not ready for them. The books were banned almost immediately across multiple countries. His name became, for the better part of a century, a synonym for dangerous thinking. Leibniz, who had visited him in person and borrowed from his thinking, in ways he never publicly acknowledged, later went out of his way to distance himself. Pierre Bayle's influential dictionary described Spinoza's system as the most monstrous doctrine a philosopher had ever proposed. Theologians across denominational lines found, in the rare event of agreeing on anything, that this particular system required refutation. To call someone a Spinozist in the early 18th century was not a philosophical label. It was an accusation. Then something shifted in the German-speaking world around the turn of the 19th century. The Romantics and the Idealists, searching for a philosophy adequate to their ambitions, found Spinoza waiting. Goethe read him and reported that his mind became calm and wide in a way he could not otherwise achieve. Hegel argued that to begin philosophy without Spinoza was to begin without getting started, that the unified vision he had grasped was the indispensable foundation of serious systematic thought. The 19th century found other uses for him. Feuerbach and Marx recognized in his naturalism a framework for understanding how consciousness is shaped by material conditions rather than descending from transcendent sources. Nietzsche, who acknowledged very few predecessors, saw an early attempt to think clearly about morality once supernatural justification has been removed. Freud recognized, near the end of his career, that what he called the unconscious had been anticipated by Spinoza's analysis of how inadequate ideas drive behavior from below the surface of awareness. The 20th century brought him back in the language of physics. When Einstein was asked whether he believed in God, he replied that he believed in Spinoza's God, revealed through the rational structure of the universe, not intervening in human affairs or responding to prayer. This was not a diplomatic evasion. Einstein meant it precisely and said so repeatedly. He had found in the lens-grinder's metaphysics the closest available philosophical description of what physics itself was discovering about the nature of reality. Then came the neuroscientists. Antonio Damasio did not go to Spinoza looking for confirmation of his laboratory findings. He arrived there because the concepts his research required. The inseparability of body and mind, the cognitive structure of emotion, the role of felt bodily states in rational decision-making, were already articulated in the Ethics, with a precision that centuries of subsequent philosophy had not improved upon. The book he wrote about this encounter he titled, with deliberate intent, Looking for Spinoza. The title acknowledged a direction of debt that usually runs the other way. Environmental philosophers found him essential for a different reason. The crisis of how human beings relate to the natural world, treating it as a resource to be managed rather than a system of which we are part, required a philosophical framework in which the separation between humanity and nature was not the starting premise. Spinoza had never started there. In his system, human beings are not observers standing outside nature, administering it from a position of studied distance. We are expressions of it, temporarily conscious of our own membership. Political theorists working on participatory democracy found in his analysis of collective intelligence a framework that anticipated problems they were only beginning to name. Psychologists working on intrinsic motivation found the structure of his argument beneath their own empirical findings. In each field, the pattern was the same: a researcher arriving at a position and discovering, with some surprise, that the position had been occupied for 300 years. What this accumulation tells us is worth holding carefully. Spinoza did not predict the future. He did not foresee neuroscience or ecological collapse or the attention economy. What he did was think carefully enough about what is permanent in human nature and reality that his conclusions kept becoming relevant as new problems made old confusions visible. Ideas that keep returning are not ahead of their time. They are simply true in ways that particular moments are not yet prepared to receive. 350 years later, we are still catching up. There is a question underneath everything Spinoza wrote, one he never quite stated directly because it was too large to state directly. It is the question of what a human life is actually for. Not what it should produce, not how it should be measured, but what it is for from the inside, to the person living it. Every answer that reaches outside the person, to divine plan, to social approval, to the accumulation of goods and the judgment of others, he found structurally insufficient. The sufficiency he was pointing toward was of a different kind. A life that has genuinely developed the capacity to understand what it is part of, and to love what it understands, without requiring anything in return. If this made the ordinary world look slightly different tonight, if the anxiety feels a little more legible, or the question of what you are actually doing and why feels more worth sitting with, then stay. There is more here. More thinkers who looked at the foundations of how we live and came back with something useful and uncomfortable. More ideas that were called dangerous before they became obvious. More of this. The question Spinoza spent his life circling without ever fully resolving it, because it cannot be resolved once and put down, only returned to with better tools each time, is this: how much of what you believe you want is actually yours, and how would you ever know the difference?